After studying this module, you shall be able to know about human development from a lifespan perspective. Learn how culture impacts development. Identify the culture specific conceptualizations of development over lifespan. Evaluate the culture specific developmental practices. Analyze the role of culture in developmental policy. Historically, human development was seen as taking place in infancy and childhood, thus assuming that further development is not very interesting. Most personality characteristics, for example intelligence, social competence, were seen as fully developed by young adulthood without undergoing significant changes thereafter. With more refined empirical studies on human development, it became obvious that individual behavior can significantly change until very old age. Therefore, an important issue of modern developmental psychology is to study stabilities and change of human development over the lifespan. One explanation of changes in human behavior over the lifespan focuses on biological processes, for example, hormonal production in puberty, biological changes in old age. Another approach to developmental change focuses on the changing social roles throughout the course of one's life, thereby studying age-related norms and developmental tasks. Both perspectives are too narrow since they ignore the role of the individual person who actively constructs his or her development. These perspectives need to be integrated in a broader framework of developmental in culture. The neglect of culture in present developmental research is startling since even a historical perspective on changes of developmental tasks in one society like India clearly demonstrates significant differences among various cohorts. For example, the period of adolescence is extended or the beginning of adulthood is no longer characterized by establishing of a family, and parenthood is no longer a normative event in the life of an adult man or a woman. Thus, it is problematic to define a specific developmental age by reference to chronological age. At least the functional age, the biological age, the psychological and the social age need to be taken into account. The social age is defined by expectations of the socio-cultural group, which role a person should play at a certain chronological age. The social meaning of age groups can change according to the social construction of age and development. Another example in the same line of reasoning is the longevity, which is a result of scientific and medical advancement, occurs for an increasingly larger proportion of older adults and offers new options for development over the lifespan in technologically advanced modern societies. Accordingly, very old age has become a new phenomenon in developmental psychology which simply cannot be accounted for by a social constructionist view, but obviously is affected by interactions between biological conditions and culture. Modern developmental psychology now goes far beyond infancy and childhood, includes studies on adolescence, adulthood and old age. Even intracultural comparisons based on data from different historical periods point to the impact of culture and of changing socio-cultural norms on development. They also demonstrate that the conceptualization of human development, the areas of research in developmental psychology, and the understanding of development over the life course has changed significantly during the last century. A historical view alone can already demonstrate the influence of the socio-cultural context on development, the conceptualization of human development, the choice of topics for research, the theorizing, the methods used, and the empirical results. However, a major shortcoming of developmental psychology still is the uncritical neglect of culture in human development. This is also true for the study of human development over the lifespan. Within this framework, in recent years, the idea that the cultural dimension must be included in the development policies and action has become generally accepted. Due to the prioritization of sustainable human development over other more econometric developmental models, culture has been studied as a necessary element for the full development of people and communities. Now we deal with the culture-specific conceptualizations of development. Here first we will talk about childhood. In some cultures, childhood directly leads to adulthood without transitions such as the developmental stage of adolescence. In these cultures, children are continuously prepared to take adult roles, including having children of their own, as soon as their physical maturation allows. Furthermore, the developmental tasks related to the developmental stages obviously differ among cultures, and they can change in one culture over time. For instance, in some cultures, children are free from any adult responsibilities. They are viewed as being part of heaven and God, as historically as the case in Japan. In other cultures, children are seen as economic resource for the parents and the family. In Western societies, children are rather regarded as separate or independent. They are rather conceived of as partners of their parents or as little adults being responsible for what they are doing and having to decide themselves. They are conceived of as having certain rights for which they get institutionalized support. Early in life, they acquire the need to be strong-willed and self-determined, as is the case in many postmodern Western cultures. Adolescence. In some cultures, adolescence simply does not occur because of the obligations of adulthood or the adult roles after physical maturation. The end of childhood and beginning of adolescence is characterized in some cultures by extended rituals, separation of male adolescents from the family, and integration in the male peer group headed by an adult male leader. In other cultures, due to the increasing role of education, adolescence is a separate and sometimes difficult developmental stage, which is rather extended relative to other developmental stages. Here, adolescence is characterized by a more or less prolonged moratorium, which should allow the adolescents develop a sense of identity in order to be able to fulfill adult roles later on. Some studies support the view that this period is characterized as storm and stress and emotional insecurity, contradicting other studies which did not find empirical support for the notion of adolescence as a period of crisis. A dominant view has been that adolescence is characterized by striving for autonomy and independence from parents and by achieving developmental growth through relatedness with peers. However, cross-cultural studies show culture-specific relations between parents and their adolescent children related to the adolescent's preference for independence and autonomy. Adulthood. Adulthood is usually characterized by establishing a family, taking responsibilities as parents and as active members of the society, for example in economic production, in political institutions, etc. However, cultures differ with respect to conceptualizing adulthood and related developmental tasks of adults. Also, social changes are affecting gender role and thereby the family system, including the conditions for child care and parent-child relations. Old age. The concept of old age is related to different age groups in different cultures, presumably depending on the normal life expectancy in a specific culture. In many industrialized societies, development over the lifespan is extended into very old age. This is brought about by technological and social changes which give rise to increasing longevity as well as related changes in the roles of women and men, family systems and developmental conditions such as health and well-being. Therefore, the concept of old age comprises different meanings in different cultures. Certain cultures pay high respect to old-aged people who are conceived of as possessing natural legitimate authority and wisdom and who are taken care of by the family. In contrast, in modern urbanized societies, the nuclear family prevails and independence is highly valued. Here, old-aged people rather prefer to be independent, relying on their own resources and or the social welfare system. Now we deal with culture-specific developmental processes. This accounts for the normal developing child failing adequately to acknowledge, far less account for diversities in young children's lives. The striking variations in how childhood is understood and experienced and how it is applied to individual and groups of children in relation to their age, gender, maturity, social status, etc. Cross-cultural studies go some way to offering an antidote to the decontextualization, idealization and normalization of particular child development practices. For example, the caregiving style of white, middle-class mothers has dominated research, a style which in global terms is atypical. Following sections deal with 3 such culture-specific developmental practices that support this argument. One is toilet training. Approaches to toilet training have changed in recent decades, with experts now recommending a child-centered approach. These shifts provide an instructive example of how changes in cultural beliefs about children can interact with changes in technology. Traditionally, the emphasis was on teaching children to use the toilet at the earliest age possible. Methods were often coercive, including scolding or physical punishment in case of an accident. These early unkind approaches to toilet training reflected a cultural belief in the appropriateness of strong parental authority. Toddlers were to be toilet trained as soon as possible so that parents would be relieved of the mess and work of changing and cleaning their diapers. The needs of the parents were the top priority, not the needs of the children. Methods of toilet training evolved in the late 20th century, supported by changes in parenting beliefs as well as developments in technology. Parents became less concerned with establishing authority over children and more concerned with children's psychological well-being. Childcare authorities warned that harsh early toilet training could be psychologically damaging and that parents should be patient and allow the timing of toilet training to be determined by the toddler's readiness as shown by their interest in using the toilet. A child-centered approach to toilet training is recommended by experts, part of a more general child-centered approach to parenting that places the needs of children above the needs of parents. The second perspective we discuss is breastfeeding and weaning. Cultures vary widely in whether and how long mothers breastfed their children. However, based on what we know of human history and of practices today in traditional cultures, it is clear that breastfeeding for 2 to 3 years old has been the most typical custom. If breastfeeding takes place for only a few weeks or months during infancy, the transition from breast to bottle usually takes place fairly smoothly, especially if the bottle is introduced gradually. However, the longer breastfeeding continues into toddlerhood, the more challenging weaning becomes when the mother decides the time has come for the child to stop drinking breast milk. This is because the toddler is much more socially aware than the infant and much more capable of exercising intentional behavior. The toddler can also speak up in a way the infant cannot to make demands and protest prohibitions. Consequently, most traditional cultures have customary practices for weaning toddlers from the breast. Often the approach is gentle and gradual at first, but becomes harsher if the toddler resists. For example, in Bali, parents feed their babies some solid food from the first few days of life and attempt gradual weaning at about age 2. However, if the gradual approach does not work, mothers coat their breasts with bitter tasting herbs. Similarly, toddlers in rural villages in Turkey were weaned at about age 2, but if they persist in trying to breastfeed, the mother coats her breasts with tomato paste. The child usually cries and protests, but the methods work without fail. Then we talk about the role of fathers. In nearly all cultures, mothers play a central role in the care of infants and toddlers. Fathers in traditional cultures are often excluded entirely from the birth process. The mother and neonate are usually together constantly in the weeks after birth, whereas the father may or may not be involved in early care. In most cultures, through nearly all of human history, male and female gender roles have been separate and distinct. In other adult roles, Woman has been expected to run the household and care for children, whereas men have been expected to protect and provide for the family. In most cultures, historically, fathers have been on the periphery of the emotional lives of children. The role of fathers in traditional cultures is very well known, and the fathers are rarely involved in daily child care in such cultures. For example, in China, the father's traditional role is provider and disciplinarian. Care and nurturance is left to the mother. In Latin America too, the tradition is that the father provides for the family and has unquestioned authority over his children, although in many Latin American cultures, this role coexists with warm, affectionate relations with his children. Although the most common cultural pattern worldwide is that fathers serve as providers but are otherwise remote from the emotional lives of infants and toddlers, there are some notable exceptions, however. Fathers in the Walpiri culture of the Aboriginal Australia have a close relationship with their toddlers but forge a unique bond with their daughters. Among the Manus of New Guinea, studied by Margaret Mead, during the first year of life, the infant and mother are together almost constantly and the father is involved only occasionally. However, once the child enters toddlerhood and begins to walk, the father takes over most child care. Role of fathers in developed countries is somewhat different. Across cultures in the East as well as in the West, fathers in industrialized societies interact less with their infants and toddlers than mothers do and provide less care such as bathing, feeding, dressing and soothing. When fathers do interact with their infants and toddlers, it tends to be in play rather than care, especially in physical, highly stimulating, rough and tumble play. Culture and development policy. Unfortunately, assumptions about what counts as normal development are frequently applied unqualified within international policy and curriculum development. For example, the World Bank proposes that the first 8 years of life can be summarized in 7 developmental stages. In each case, children are described in terms of what they do and what they need. For example, children at 1 to 2 years enjoy stories and experimenting with objects, walk steadily, climb stairs, run, assert independence, and by 2 to 3.5 years require opportunities to engage in dramatic play, increasingly complex books, sing favorite songs, work simple puzzles, etc. For early childhood experts rooted in Western cultural traditions and values, these stages express taken for granted truths about early development. In reality, these descriptions are full of culture-specific assumptions, for example, about children's home environment, the availability of books, puzzles, and the value placed in independence. At the same time, they homogenize children, making no allowance for individual differences or for gender differences or for any other aspects of diversity. In consequence, this vision for early childhood development bears little resemblance to the realities of the lives of millions of the world's children, even less to the resources realistically available to foster their development. Culture and development process. Recognizing the social and cultural dimensions of early childhood is not just about acknowledging diverse and changing cultural traditions. Important though this is, it isn't just about acknowledging that development and learning occur in and are influenced by multiple social and cultural contexts. These attempts to accommodate social and cultural factors falter if they still hold on to core assumptions about the development as a largely universal, natural, individual process of the child progressively constructing a sense of self and surroundings through relatively stable stages of development. In fact, the scientific evidence for such core assumptions is largely derived from Piagetian constructivist theory, and it's much less robust than is generally assumed and has been extensively critiqued since the 1970s. At the same time, developmental researchers have increasingly drawn on an alternative theoretical framework which seems to account for more adequately for social and cultural dimensions of early development, informed specially by Vygotsky's social constructivist theory. On this view, the young child's development is as much cultural as it is natural. Stages are embedded in social practices as much as in processes of maturation. In fact, children's development might most accurately be described as naturally cultural. Recognizing development as a socio-cultural process has important implications for policy, curriculum, and pedagogy. Instead of seeing early childhood as a universal, decontextualized process of developing towards a taken for granted state of maturity, it draws attention to young children's engagement with a range of settings, relationships, activities, and skills through which they acquire culturally located competencies and identities. Development is about the acquisition of cognitive tools and cultural competencies which are themselves product of human civilization, forms of discourse, literacy, numeracy, and more recently information technology that are adaptive to particular socio-economic contexts and historical epochs. In summary, the general implication is that benchmarks of quality in early childhood are not intrinsic, fixed and prescribed by scientific knowledge about development, although science clearly has a crucial role to play in informing quality development. In due course, human societies may come to share beliefs about what is normal and natural and appropriate for all young children, but universal consensus would not make these beliefs or arrangements for their implementation any less cultural. So far, research and literature in human development has largely ignored reference to culture as a factor determining and or influencing development over the lifespan. However, historical evidence suggests the important role played by culture in the context of development. In recent years, the idea that the cultural dimension must be included in the development policies and actions has become generally accepted. Due to prioritization of sustainable human development over other more econometric development models, culture has been studied as a necessary element for the full development of people and communities. The conceptualization of the so-called universal developmental stages such as childhood, adolescence, adulthood and old age are also culture dependent. Accounts of the normal developing child fail adequately to acknowledge, far less account for diversities in young children's lives, the striking variations in how childhood is understood and experienced, and how it is applied to individual and groups of children in relation to their age, gender, maturity, social status, etc. Common practices regarding infant care and child development like involvement of fathers, breastfeeding, weaning and toilet training also vary widely across cultures. Contextually appropriate practice draws attention to the many aspects in which early childhood policies, services, curricula and practices must of necessity take account of the circumstances of children's lives, the material and cultural resources available to parents and communities, as well as their expectations and aspirations for their young children. Children's development might most accurately be described as naturally culture. Hence, in words of Vygotsky, every function in the child's cultural development appears twice, first on the social level and later on the individual level. First between people, that is interpsychological, and then inside the child, that is intrapsychological. This applies equally to voluntary attention, to logical memory and to the formation of concepts. All the higher functions originate as actual relationships between individuals.